Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to talk about my John Deere 14SB green deck. Now this particular mower has a personal connection because growing up in the late 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, I was using this mower on my grandparents' farm in Keithville, Louisiana, mowing fence lines with it. And after my grandfather passed away, my mother inherited it, then I inherited it. So I was using this in the 90s to mow not only our lawn, but using it to mow neighbors and friends' lawns to make money in high school. You know, that was the GoFundMe before GoFundMe existed. So this mower probably has maybe a couple thousand hours on it, if I had to guess. Like just an insane amount of hours. And I used it up until about 2016, 2017, when it started smoking pretty bad, and then eventually lost compression. And it's just, you know, it had a lot of use, heavy use. The engine in this was a splash lubricated Kawasaki FC150. It was made in Japan until 1989, and then they moved production to Marysville, Missouri. And so then from that point forward, the Kawasaki engines were made in USA, and then later they moved them to China. And then, of course, you know, the quality kind of went downhill, but that's for another story. So anyway, I made the decision that I wanted to see this mower live on. And so I decided to restore it. And when I restore stuff, you know, I want to try to do it as right as possible. The exception would be the engine. I did, instead of rebuilding the old engine, I found a newer engine off of the mid-90s John Deere's. It's the same engine. The only difference is instead of it being splash lubricated, it's pressure lubricated, so it has an oil filter. Other than that, it's essentially the same engine. In a way, I converted it to a newer style engine. I had the deck stripped, welded the cracks, powder coated it, and everything else. All the other metal parts, I tried to powder coat them. The chrome handles, which were pitted, I had those powder coated shiny silver instead of re-chroming them, just because the cost was so exorbitant to do that. And you know, it's one of those, it's a value be damned type of situation, because it's definitely sentimental. The hardest part for this mower was finding wheels for it, and I'll get to that here in just a minute. So a little bit about the history of this mower. This particular mower was made by a company called OMC, Outdoor Marine Corporation. You know, familiar with like Evinrude and some of the other brands. Well, they owned Lawn Boy, and Lawn Boy is who built these mowers for John Deere, and you may hear them referred to as John Boys. They were made from 86 to 88, and that was it. This particular 14SB was only made for 1988 only. They made a two-cycle version, 86, 87, and 88, but the four-cycle was only for 1988. And the reason for that is in 1989, OMC was sold to Toro. So that was a direct competitor to John Deere. That presented an issue, so it left them scrambling to redesign everything, and I talk about that in another video. But that made this a one-year only mower. And amazingly enough, they sold tens of thousands of these mowers. They sold these in 1988 as a 14SB and a 14SE, which is essentially the same mower, just with electric start. That's the only difference. Still self-propelled, still 5-speed, but they were not without their flaws. And primarily, the issue is the rear wheels. They had a tough torque Kanzaki all-metal transmission, but with metal gears driving them, but the wheels there was an internal gear on the inside of the wheel that was plastic. Well, all it takes is stripping the wheels just barely, you know, if it gets caught or something, or maybe a piece of rock or something gets caught in those, ruins the wheel. The downside to that is the last wheel was made for these mowers in 2001. So you're talking about 24 years that the wheels have been discontinued for these mowers. And if you try to find a parts mower, there's a pretty good chance that they've already got bad wheels. So that makes an incredible demand for these rear wheels. Very, very hard to find. Fortunately, when I was growing up, mowing lawns in the 90s, we had some fail. enough to the point that my dad just went out to the John Deere dealer and bought several of them. And so I had a couple new old stock spare wheels on the shelf for this, and I'm still not using them on the restored version because I want to save them in case I ever need them. These wheels, they used a bushing instead of a bearing like some of the later models. So those bronze bushings would wear out, and those are also hard to find as well. So when you find these mowers used, they've usually got floppy wheels, and that's because the bushings are worn out, or the gears have worn, the tires are worn on. You know, there's a bunch of issues with that. The rest of the mowers, great. There was a 2-cycle version of this that they called the 12SB, but it used a Lawn Boy 200 series, F200 series engine, which the only difference with those is they actually had the exhaust out on the top instead of underneath the deck like all the other Lawn Boys of that vintage. But you don't come across those too often. I don't know how many of those were sold. The serial numbers indicate there's probably about 10 or 15,000 or so that were sold, but I don't know that for fact. So anyway, as I said, these Kawasaki engines, they originally were splash lubricated. Now they're pressure lubricated for all the later models. And so that meant that it was a little bit better on hills. You weren't going to starve the engine of oil if you were mowing on a hillside or like mowing the bank of a pond. Or I've talked in another video about some of the silver deck John Deere 14SBs, which that's what came after this mower. And there were 3 major faults. One of them I've already talked about. It was the wheels. Another one was they used an igniter on the side of the engine to turn off the coil when you brought the throttle to 0. Those were known to fail, and they were about $100 to replace. And you can convert it to the newer style coil and then not have that problem. And that's what a lot of people end up doing on these. The third issue was they came with a BBC, a blade brake clutch, not the other BBC. I know where your mind is, dirty minds. The blade brake clutch was made in Japan by a company called Ogura, and that particular system was known to fail because it had a cover under it that would hold grass clippings, and it would stay wet. It would rust the assembly or damage the bearings prematurely. And that whole assembly was several $100s. It was very expensive. So that in itself was a reason why it didn't work very well, especially as it aged. Fortunately, when the 90s mowers came out, they had a newer design, and you could convert to that design, as I've done on this mower as well. You convert to the newer design, it's a little more reliable, it doesn't have that cover anymore. This mower, when we were using it growing up, I was very cautious about not mowing wet grass. And I know that's not an option for everybody, but you know, I grew up in Nebraska. This mower started in Louisiana, Texas, and then moved to us in Nebraska, and then followed me when I moved back to Texas. And I'm very conscientious about not mowing wet grass with it. So the original blade clutch, it lasted almost 30 years. You know, that's pretty good considering the amount of hours that were on it. But yeah, other than replacing the rear wheels, and then we did replace the igniter at least twice that I remember over the years. And now it's, you know, converted to the new style with the newer engine. But it's really been a fantastic mower, and you can pick them up on Marketplace all day long for $20 to $50 usually, unless they're in really, really good shape, maybe 100, 150. So you can still get them fairly inexpensive for what they were. I have the original receipt when this was purchased in 1988. In February of 1988, it was $581 in 1988. So in today's money, I'll put that on your screen right there. That's what it cost. Very expensive mower for what it was. And I said, they're really great mowers. When they pop up, they're usually running because they have a Mikuni carb, very good carb. You can still buy parts for it. Easy to service, easy to clean. The other Achilles heel would maybe be cracks in the deck. So you just have to kind of watch that. And that's about it. So, you know, don't be surprised if you're looking for one of these and they come up with cracks in them. You know, it's just part of it, but it's not structural. And you got to remember, these mowers are almost 40 years old. So anyway, wanted to share that with you. So thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you soon.